Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for attending. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you, Bill Handel, for putting on this event. And thank you, Andrew, for being our representative and helping us to accommodate being here. Our discussion today is going to be on motorcycle collisions, traumatic brain injuries, also to a lesser extent bicycle injuries. What we're talking about today is what are the rules of the road with regard to motorcyclists and bicyclists, and what are the harms and losses that can occur when those rules of the road are violated. I'm going to show an example here. So a motorcycle collision, it's online, which you can see the motorcyclist is traveling straight. The vehicle changes lanes and knocks the motorcyclist into a stationary object. That particular accident will result in acceleration-deceleration injury to the head, which we'll talk about a little bit at the end of this seminar. But what we're going to talk about is who has the right to use the road. Oftentimes, when we are in court, we are voir diring juries, and juries tend to have a bias against motorcyclists and bicyclists. Oftentimes, this bias comes from a fear that we are, as motorists, going to strike the bicyclists or the motorcyclists, and that because they're more susceptible to greater harm, that they should assume more liability than we as motorists who are driving on the road. This is simply not the case in California. In California, we have an obligation to share the road the same as everybody else with motorcyclists and bicyclists, as if they were driving cars. Now, under California law, juries will decide who is at fault for a particular negligence claim. The instruction that is read to the jury by the judge is a judicial council jury instruction. It is a form instruction. It is instruction number 700, more than likely for most cases, involving automobile collisions. Judicial council jury instruction 700 specifies that a person must use reasonable care in operating a vehicle and keep on the lookout for others. Failure to do so is what results in negligence. Whether this is someone that is operating a motorcycle, a bicycle, or a motor vehicle, the same rules apply. You must be reasonable in your use of your vehicle, and you must keep a lookout. When it comes to moving from side to side within a lane, as we saw in that previous video, there is also judicial council jury instruction governing what must be done. When someone moves, they must do so with reasonable care. As you noticed in the video that we watched, as you observed in the video that we watched, the driver who is operating the motorcycle or operating the motor vehicle appeared to change lanes into the motorcyclist. As you also watch, the motorcyclist is passing the motor vehicle on the outside. We don't know what the governing speed is on that roadway, but we do know that the law governs the safe movement of a vehicle from side to side. Since the vehicle that was operating, the operator of the car was changing lanes without looking, this instruction is one that a jury would likely get from a judge. Now, do these also apply to cyclists? When a cyclist is on the road, they have the same rights as well as the same obligations as a motorist. Under the California Vehicle Code, section 21200 subsection a bicyclist has the same obligations and privileges as a motorist, which means they must also follow the rules of the road. If they do not follow the rules of the road, they are going to be accountable for their own injuries or any harms that they cause to anyone else. However, unlike a motorist, a motorcyclist or a bicyclist must have safety gear. Under California law, California Vehicle Code section 27803A requires motorcyclists as well as bicyclists under the previous California Vehicle Code section to wear a helmet. Helmets are safety gear, okay? And a helmet is what prevents a lot of injuries. Now, helmets will not prevent all injuries, but they will reduce injuries. Hi, guys. The type of helmet that is required by the state of California is a DOT-approved helmet. Now, the DOT has a safety guide or a safety requirement that has a need for a liner. The safety liner here, it's an energy-absorbing liner. There's also a cushion inside the liner to keep the helmet steady. There's a restraint system, and there's a requirement for a hard outer shell. This is DOT compliant. However, it is only a half helmet. The DOT does not require a chin bar on a helmet. So you can have a DOT compliant helmet that is the German half helmet style and still be compliant with the law. A helmet with the chin bar, though, is much safer. It's something that we would always recommend that you use. I know that there are advantages to a half helmet in that you have better visibility, you can hear things coming, it's more comfortable, it's not as restrictive. But if you're going to be in a catastrophic accident, you'd much rather have this type of helmet instead of this type of helmet because it's going to afford you protection of your facial bones. When you don't have a full face helmet, the front of the face is going to be exposed. You can cause significant fractures. One of the worst case scenarios is a Le Fort 3 fracture, such as demonstrated here. If it breaks in all three connecting points, the left, the center, and the right, it is going to separate the skull in half. A Le Fort 3 fracture requires approximately 1,400 pounds of pressure. Believe me, that does happen from time to time. That 1,400 pounds of pressure is generated by about 320 G's of force. To give you an example of what it would take to create 1,400 pounds of pressure, you would have to take a 25-pound weight and drop it 11.5 feet directly down onto your surface. By the time that that gets from the drop to the surface, it's going to generate 1,400 pounds of pressure. That's what it takes to create these kinds of injuries. But it doesn't take a lot of speed to create that type of force on a motorcyclist. So is it okay to wear a DOT shorty helmet? It's legal. Is it safe? It's not as safe as wearing a DOT full face. One thing you'll never want to do is you'll never want to wear a non-compliant novelty helmet. Novelty helmets lack any absorption in the lining, and the surface is much more pliable, it's not as hard, and the restraint system is not as good. These types of helmets afford little to no protection to the rider. In a recent case that we went to verdict on in February, our client was traveling straight on the roadway. A driver pulled out of a driveway and caused him to go flying off of his motorcycle. At the time of the accident, he was driving down a very quiet street. It was very calm. It was about 20 miles, 15 to 20 miles an hour below the speed limit that he was traveling. He was wearing a half helmet. When his vehicle came into contact with the other vehicle, his vehicle was going about 22 to 23 miles per hour. The impact created a lift in the back of the bike. The back of the bike went up about a foot, creating about an 11-degree increase or incline in his attitude towards the ground. He was standing on the brake pedal to try and slow his vehicle down in that emergency move. When his vehicle came into contact with the other vehicle, when his motorcycle came into contact, he was catapulted forward about 40 feet, and he went about 8 to 10 feet in the air, his head going about 12 feet up in the air. When he came down, he achieved that 320 G's of force, that 1,400 pounds to create that Le Fort 3 fracture that would have potentially been avoided with something full face. As you'll see, it doesn't take a lot of energy to get someone that high in the air when they're struck in an automobile collision. Now, what I'm showing here is the fracture. This is a CT scan that was rendered in a 3D. The CT scan essentially identifies each of the fractures that were sustained, some of which, or most of which, probably could have been avoided had this person been wearing a full face helmet. These types of fractures go all the way through the orbital, they go across the maxillary, and it did detach the face from one part of the head to another. Required extensive surgery, also about 2 months in an induced coma. One thing that helmets cannot prevent in high-speed accidents is brain injuries. Helmets can prevent brain injuries in low-speed traumas. However, because the brain is within the skull, it's not tied down, it's movable, and when the skull moves, the brain goes with it. When the skull stops moving, because of inertia, the brain still continues to move in whatever direction it was moving prior to the sudden stop. When the brain comes into contact with the inside of the skull, you get bruising. Sometimes you get subdermal hematomas, you get bleeding, but you definitely get bruising when you strike. No helmet can prevent that from occurring. What will happen is the brain, depending on the strength of the forces involved, will then bounce off one side of the skull and strike the other side of the skull. This bouncing and rebounding is called a coup contra coup injury. These types of bruising can result in axonal tearing, it can result in brain bruises, it can result in a number of different long-term and short-term cognitive, memory, and emotional problems. Now, not generally, but specifically, there are three types of traumatic brain injuries. The most common traumatic brain injury is mild. 95% of brain injuries are mild traumatic brain injuries. Mild traumatic brain injuries are characterized as such because the damage or the harm from that injury lasts anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes. No residual problems, no amnesia. Those types of injuries generally do not require significant medical attention, if any medical attention at all. Then, if the problems continue beyond 30 minutes for a couple of hours, you have what's called a moderate brain injury. Moderate brain injuries have the same loss of function as a mild traumatic brain injury. However, the conditions do not improve after 30 minutes and they worsen. You definitely want to get medical attention. You definitely want to make sure that that person has not got a subdermal hematoma. Get a CT scan, get an MRI scan, rule out anything life-threatening, and start right away if that's happening. With regard to severe brain traumas are sometimes obvious. Person's lost consciousness. They have a Glasgow Coma Scale of 0. They're out for a long period of time. They have retrograde amnesia, comatose. These types of injuries will definitely end up in the emergency room. These are people that will need serious medical attention, and they may and will have long-term consequences. Oftentimes, these are the result of acceleration-deceleration. What happens in acceleration-deceleration injuries sometimes is if someone is struck directly, you'll get the coup contra coup injury that we talk about. However, if the injury is off axis, it's not a straight injury, it's only at a certain degree, like 45 degrees, what will happen is the brain will then spin. It's called a rotational injury. The rotational injuries are going to have significant axonal damage because the axons, which are the connectors between the neurons are the parts of the brain that do the thinking, the axons are the wires that connect it. When you have that kind of torquing of the brain, what will happen is those axons will be stretched and torn, and those axons will result, that loss of axon will be diffuse. That diffuse axonal damage will result in a very widespread damage to a brain. That widespread damage to a brain will result in early onset of dementia. We have only so many axons in our brains, and as we get older, those axons die off. If we start off with millions less axons than with which we started, then we're going to have early onset of problems that older people would have much earlier in life, 20, 30 years ahead of time. Those millions of axons that can be damaged in a rotational injury are the ones that would be otherwise lost as you get older. But if they're gone, your first line of defense is already gone and you're looking at early dementia. In our particular case, where we had a verdict in February in LA, we did something I think that no one's done yet. I think we're the first ones. It's called a DTI scan, which was made into a 3D image, which was actually presented to the jury. In this particular DTI scan, you can see in the areas that are glowing red, actual axonal damage. Axons are actually missing where it says paucity of white matter tracks, these axons are no longer present. No one I know of has ever produced this type of imagery for a jury, and no one I know of has ever gotten this in front of a jury. This is pretty new technology, and having it 3D and presented was something that was really afforded, a benefit that was really afforded to our client in our case. One of the reasons why the jury found that our client was entitled to significant damages. The award in that case was $16 million of damage for the harms that he had suffered, including his future medical expenses, his future wage loss. Very large recovery for someone that was really deserving for the types of harms that he got. Part of the reason the jury gave him that, they indicated to us in post-trial, was because of the demonstrative evidence as the CT that we've shown, the 3D CT, and the DTI scan that we just showed. When you have a significant intrusion into the skull, you're going to have a clear loss of brain matter. As you can see in the comparison side by side here, the left brain has all of its lobe. The right brain is missing a significant part of one side of the lobe. You can see the dark section where there was normally white matter. When you have a very large brain trauma with intrusion into the skull, you can see on a regular MRI the loss of white matter of the brain, which is a severe traumatic brain injury. What we showed on the DTI scan just a moment ago does not show up on a regular MRI scan. Those axons are not visible in this type of scan. Two completely different radiographs which provide absolutely different information, both of which show a very, very big harm to an individual. When you have a damage to the frontal lobes, when you have, let's say, someone who gets into an accident and they have a front injury, you're going to have a pretty clear set of types of harms. They'll include an altered personality, irritability. There will be depression. The depression will be partly because they know things are not the way they should be, because things are chronic. It's also a characteristic of the harm. They will have emotional problems. They will be unable to filter certain things. We all have certain inhibitions. We all have certain filters for our personality. We don't do things that are socially inappropriate because of the breaks that we have in our head. Those breaks are contained in the front lobes. If those breaks are gone, you're going to have a lot of strange personality occurrences. Another thing that the frontal lobes control is anger. If you have frontal lobe damage, you can have someone who's easily angered. You're also going to have attention problems. Attention problems are some things that people will say, well, I have attention problems and I don't have a brain injury. These are more significant. People who cannot stay on task, people who are easily distracted. Dory in Finding Nemo, ooh, shiny, things like that. Concentration problems. People can't finish reading something. They start a project, they can never get it done. They also have significant memory loss, and they have amnesia at times. But they also have trouble getting off the couch, initiating. They look like they're being lazy. They're not. They have lost the get up and go mechanism in their brain to make them get up and go. Also, when you have these types of major brain traumas, you have an inability to learn and retain new information. That is a big deal because you're stuck at a certain square. If you have a job and you have an inability to learn new information, you're not going to be able to keep up with your job as new technologies come along, especially people that work at a desk, computers, and so forth. But even people who work in manufacturing, as machines come along, as different equipment comes along, you don't have the ability to learn and retain that if you have a significant frontal lobe damage. So those are the types of things that one can expect when you have a severe brain trauma. The extent of our discussion has been covered, and it has been a great privilege for us to be able to share this information with the crowd. And I look forward to the opportunity to help anybody who has any further information or any questions. Give us a call, and thank you very much for having us. Have a good day.